special guest. His name is Greg Koukl. He's the founder and president of Stand to Reason.
What we want to do is interact with Greg on a book he wrote a little while ago called Tactics, a Game Plan for Discussing Your Christian Conviction. And as you can tell by the title, what Greg is looking to do through this book, I think he's done very well, is equip Christians in, I think, very winsome and powerful ways to explain the Christian convictions, explain the Christian worldview through the method of questioning, that rather than asserting things, that we do well to use questions to first help people see the fallacies in the things that they believe, and then hopefully by God's grace be able to begin to point people towards Christian truths. Is that a good way to describe what you're looking to do in that book?
Yeah, it's a great way to describe it. I mean, the questions are the core. All our tactics have names, and the questioning tactic is called Columbo, which is another throwback to the 60s and 70s, but it's people even nowadays remember Lieutenant Columbo. Peter Falk played the character. But he's an icon because he scratched his head, always looked like he couldn't think his way out of a wet paper bag, but he was a clever guy because he used questions in powerful ways. And this is what I try to do in the Tactics book, in at least establishing the basic game plan. So whenever you go in a situation, you don't know what you're up against, you don't know what you're going to deal with, you don't know whether a person's like old school or hip hop or whatever, and so how do you connect? Well, this game plan allows you to do that because I give you a couple of specific directions to go, a couple of steps that you can apply in any circumstance, but it allows you to manage the conversation no matter who you're talking to, whether they're really smart or whether they're really clever, they're really aggressive or whatever. You can manage the conversation and try to move it in a direction that will be productive. It doesn't always work that way because that's just the way relationships go, but at least when you have a plan, it makes things a lot easier. And so I try to offer that plan, which is why the book is called, subtitled, A Game Plan for Discussing Your Christian Convictions. And by the way, I don't think of it as evangelism. It is evangelism, but I don't think of it that way, vocab. And I think you mentioned 2 Corinthians 5 passage where, we're ambassadors for Christ. Look, at evangelists are trying to close the deal. They're trying to make the sale. They're trying to get the harvest, so to speak, and bring in the fruit and all that other stuff. The look of relief I see in people's eyes when I tell them this as an audience, and I say, you don't need to hit home runs. You don't even need to get on pace. You just need to get up to bat. And these questions will help you do that. Boy, the people just, their eyes get big and wide, and they are so thrilled because they realize this is within reach.
Yeah, I think it's good because there is sometimes a model that's really salesmanship and evangelism, and you're saying we're not salespeople, we're not peddlers, we're ambassadors for Christ.
So if you could, just what is the Columbo method? What are the questions that someone should ask?
Yeah, how does this actually work, Brother Greg?
I start with two questions that are foundational, and they're not very clever when you think about it. And the first question is, what do you mean by that? And that's just to get more information. If you think of Columbo, he shows up at the crime scene. He doesn't know what's happened. There's a dead body there, but he has no idea where to go because he doesn't have information. He's got to ask information questions to be able to get an idea of the lay of the land. And this is the same thing for us. I once ran into a witch at a photo place, and she was processing my order, and I didn't know she was a witch, but I saw the 5-point star, the pentagram around her neck, and so I asked her about the jewelry. And then this led into a conversation. She told me she was a pagan, a witch, and we ended up talking for a while about something spiritually significant. And it was nice and relaxed because I showed an interest in her by simply asking, what do you mean by that, regarding her jewelry. Sometimes people are already speaking about spiritual things, and they make particular claims. They might say things like, well, everything's relative. And this is a slogan people throw out a lot to stonewall Christians, but I'm not sure they really understand what they're talking about. And so instead of trying to defeat their view, I want to know what they mean. What do they mean by relative? What do they mean by everything? And if everything's relative, isn't the statement everything is relative part of everything? And so wouldn't that make that relative too? I want them to answer for that. I am just curious how they handle that. Notice that I am asking questions, and every time I ask the question, it tosses the ball back in their court. I'm not taking any pressure. There's no heat on me. And actually, there's not a lot of heat on them because apparently they know about what they're talking about. So if I toss the ball back in their court, they'll be talking about what they really believe. But what it does is it gives me more information. And the more questions I can ask of that sort, What do you mean by that? Whatever it happens to be, variations of that question, the more I can kind of get a bit of a spiritual topography of this person. It kind of appears before my eyes as they are explaining more about themselves. And a lot of times I can see in that explanation as they're talking, I can start to see that there's landmines in that topography, and I want to try to walk around those landmines and not set them off. And there's no pressure on you. This is what's important about asking questions. It's easy. There's no pressure, but you're guiding the conversation. Now, at some point, especially if you're into spiritual things here, the other guy is going to make a statement contrary to your views. They're going to say something like, well, Jesus never existed, or that the Bible's just a bunch of fables, or who knows, all kinds of statements that they might make. And at this point, there's another question that's important to ask. What usually happens is the Christian thinks, God, it's his job to refute that other view. No, I'm going to tell you the reasons why Jesus does exist, or I'm going to tell you why God exists, all this other thing. And instead of letting the other person do the work of defending their own view first. And we give the impression, we give them a free ride, and we give the impression that all they have to do is say something, and then we're on the hook for trying to undo the challenge that they've offered. And my view is, well, wait a minute, not so fast. Maybe you ought to spend some time giving me reasons why you just said what you said before I'm obliged to kind of to deal with it. So if you think everything is relative, I'm going to want to know, now that I've asked a couple of questions to get clear on what you mean by that, I want to know why you think that's true. And so my second question is going to be something like, well, how did you come to that conclusion that everything's relative? Or how did you come to the conclusion that Jesus is just a myth? There was no Jesus of history. Why would you think that? Now, notice again, this is a question, but it's a different kind of question. Where the first question was to gather some information, the second question is meant to require of the other person that they give reasons for the view that they just offered. Now, this is turnabout, isn't it? Because that's what they're always doing to us. We say something about Jesus, and they say, well, how do you know that? What's your reasons for it? A lot of times Christians don't have any evidence for it, so then they're not taken seriously. But we can do the same thing with the other people, and we can do it politely and graciously. It certainly is a reasonable question. I have found something interesting, though, about this, fellas, and that is whenever I ask these two questions, sometimes the first one, what do you mean by that? But lots of times the second one, how'd you come to that conclusion? I'm going to get what I call, and now I'm back to the 60s again, the sounds of silence, the Simon and Garfunkel response, which is the sounds of silence, They're not going to say anything. I ask them what they mean by that, or I ask them how'd they come to that conclusion, and they're flummoxed. They're stopped cold because they don't have reasons for their own views. And this is going to unnerve them a little bit. Not that I'm trying to embarrass them. I'm just trying to get the idea whether they've done some thinking about this or they have reasons. And so I just let them sit and think about that for a while and try to figure it out. And I'm doing them a favor because they're coming up with these ideas, and they think all they got to do is spin their fairy tales and toss out these crazy things, and then their work is done. No, their work has just begun. They've got to defend their view just like they want me to defend mine.
And
that's a huge part of the approach that we take at Stand to Reason.
And part of this, too, is also, even if they do give reasoning, beginning to have the awareness to see where people really don't have a good structure upon which to base their beliefs. That a number of times people have just glaring contradictions, or they're asserting things that you really that the reasoning behind what they assert doesn't hold. It
doesn't hold up. And by the way, this is what the rest of the book is about. The book is tactics, plural, and Columbo is just the first tactic. That's the game plan. That's what gets you going. But the rest of the tactics like taking the roof off and suicide and Rhodes Scholar and Just the Facts Ma'am and Steamroller, and these are other tactical maneuvers.
Sound like dance moves. Sounds like break dance moves or something. Yo, son, about to do the Rhodes Scholar on him real quick. Check it. Right. But no.
Call this the professor's ploy, and this is a trick that a lot of professors use on students. That is, they'll make a provocative statement, and there's a lot of professors that are out to get the Christians. I'm not saying this I'm not whining and complaining. I'm just saying that's the way it is, and you got to be ready for it. And what they'll do is they'll go after something about the Bible or Christ or Christianity, and they'll really take it down there in front of the group. And there's going to be some Christians sitting in the audience that is not going to take this sitting down. They're going to stand up. They're going to take the professor on head to head. And I think this is right-hearted, but I think it's wrong-headed. It's not wise because there's a rule of engagement that governs these things, and that is that you never make a frontal assault on a superior force in an entrenched position.
That's good.
This is just stupid. It's suicidal. But I don't say you should abandon the argument. I think you should use your tactics instead. So you can ask the professor two questions. What do you mean by that? How'd you come to that conclusion? And these are the kinds of questions that students should be able to ask. This isn't a power struggle or anything. And sometimes the professor's going to catch on, and he's going to throw it back on the student. He's going to call you out. He's going to say, you must be one of those Christians who believe the Bible's the Word of God. All right, why don't you stand up and tell everybody here why you think the Bible is the Word of God, or something like that. Well, of course, now he's played a trick, because the student has just been asking questions, and that's the tactical approach. He's not going head-to-head in a power struggle. He's just asking questions. And the professor then is throwing the burden back on the student. And this is the case where you don't take the bait. When somebody puts this burden of proof back on you, you could say something like this. Look at Professor, you don't even know what I believe because I've never talked about it. I'm just asking you questions, that's all. I mean, for all you know, I agree with you. So the point here is when you're asking questions, and this is the advantage to the tactic, you are not making any claims of your own, and when you're not making any claims of your own, you don't bear any responsibility to defend them. You're just asking questions, it's just a fair question kind of thing.
So is this the lazy man's apologetic, Greg?
Well, you might look at it that way because it makes things a lot easier.
Right.
However, your mind is always engaged in this, and it's more like one-on-one basketball than like chess because things are moving, right? Yeah. You're having a conversation, so you want to stay alert, but it does make your job a lot easier.
So is the goal of that just to not get, you talked about a superior force in an entrenched position, don't have that debate in that context?
Exactly.
Is that at all?
Yes, look, at the man with the microphone is going to win. I mean, that's just the way these things work. And so what we don't want to do is we don't want to get in a head-to-head with them. But it doesn't mean we abandon the fight. We can still maybe accomplish some things by asking our questions and see what they have to say. It might turn out when they give the answers to the questions, what do you mean by that, and how did you come to that conclusion, that they don't have good answers. And then the rest of the audience can see that they're making it up, or maybe they got a weak case or something like that.
Well, what if the professor gives an example? Well, there's different accounts in the Gospels that contradict each other. What would you say about that? He responds back.
Well, now you have a different set of circumstances. Now you're beyond the first two steps of Columbo, and you are into something a little bit more challenging. My question might be, tell me an example of the contradictions. So now that's a question, right? So I've just thrown it back into his lap. Now, of course, he may have some examples that he then cites. Then I'm going to be in a position where I either got to put up or shut up then. I either got to try to explain it on the spot if I know the answer to it, or I've got to say, well, you know what, that's a fair point. Let me get back to you on that. Would that be okay, Professor? And then you go back and you do your research and come back. You don't have to do everything kind of on your feet, as it were. Nobody's perfect in that regard. Nobody knows everything. So it's fair to ask if you can come back with an answer later. But notice how I responded to the specific. I responded with another question, which threw the ball back into his court. And questions always do that. If you can come up with a good question, all the pressure then is off of you, the ball's in his court, the attention's on him, and the pressure is on him. So this is one of the reasons that the questions are really, really helpful in just maintaining your position in a discussion and taking the pressure off of you. And let me emphasize, we mentioned this earlier, I think, but you don't have to hit home runs. You don't even have to get on base as far as I'm concerned. You just need to get up to bat and then watch and see what the Lord will do. And those first two questions will do that. And as you practice and you read the book, you learn how other parts of the tactical approach work, then you'll be able to take care of more complicated circumstances.
This is going back to the ambassador model. You have to know something at some point. So this is not just a delaying tactic for ignorant Christians to stall out forever to make the non-Christians fumble and bumble. We do need, but the idea is not to unload the full clip, as it were. You don't have to let it all go right then. You know, they say something about evolution. Well, it's not true because fossils and you don't need to do that right then. Stop.
Chill. Let me qualify that. You need more than those two questions. You need to know something in order to go the distance. But you don't need to know more than those two questions in order to get started.
Yeah, and also if you're using questions as sort of arrows to get to a target, if you don't have sort of the information at some point you need to have, you don't really know where the target is.
Exactly. Well, that's the third use of Columbo. I mentioned the first two uses, that is gaining information and reversing the burden of proof. The third use is to take somebody somewhere with your questions, to shoot at a target. And you're right. In that use, you have to know something. However, you can get going and get used to the first two questions without ever taking any risk at all. And this is tremendously encouraging to other people.
Right.
They just say, well, I'm going to use the first two questions and just let it lie and just practice that way. You get quite an education in the process.
Yeah. Now, it would be helpful just to go through a few more examples of how this plays out. One of the things you touched on before was relativism. And obviously a common thing I think many people face is people saying something to the effect of, well, we all believe all sorts of different things. I'm spiritual, you're spiritual, many ways to God, variations of that type of thing.
Right.
Let's say it's a friend or a family member. Kind of take us through how you would begin to ask questions.
Well, if somebody says that all these routes are great routes to God, they're all legitimate, I'm going to ask them, well, why would you think that? Why would you think that every religious view is equally as good as any other religious view? Okay, now there's my question. That's it, and I'm done. Now it's their job. They made the claim that all religions lead to God. How do they know that? I mean, that's a pretty bold claim when you think about it. Notice, by the way, that their claim is actually the opposite of what each religion says. Each religion says that their view is true. So this person who's trying to be open and tolerant is basically dissing all the other religions who think that they're the right way. So how does he know this? He could be right, but I'd want to know why he's so confident in this.
And you can sort of phrase it. I've heard you talk about sort of how to phrase this. Like, may I ask you a question? Why would you think that? That doesn't seem to be the case to me, but tell me, maybe you have good reasons. Why do you think that?
Maybe I'm missing something. Exactly. You can be very gentle with it. I don't know if you've considered this, but how would you respond to this question? Or this is what comes to mind to me when you say that, and I'm really curious how you see this.
Yeah.
Can you help me out here? So you don't have to be the guy thumping somebody else on the chest, You could be the mild-mannered, well, think of Columbo, He's the guy who doesn't look threatening at all. He looks stupid, right? He's scratching his head and mumbling to himself. So you could even take on the Columbo posture minus the trench coat and cigar.